The rain hammered against the windshield of the 18-wheeler as it pulled into a truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas. I clutched my duffel bag tighter, feeling the crumpled $20 bills in my pocket, all the money I had left in the world. The trucker who'd given me a ride from Denver turned to me with kind eyes that reminded me painfully of Marcus. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You sure about this, honey? It's a long way to Georgia still. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Somewhere in Savannah, my husband of 3 years was lying in a funeral home, and his family was planning to bury him without me. They'd made that crystal clear when his sister Victoria called me with the news of Marcus's sudden heart attack. Her voice had been ice cold through the phone. The funeral is family only, Olive. I think it's best if you stay in Colorado. Stay in Colorado. As if I hadn't been Marcus's wife. As if the last 3 years of our life together meant nothing. As if I didn't deserve to say goodbye to the man who'd promised me forever, just to have it cut short at 28 years old. The truck stop fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I walked into the convenience store, searching for my next ride east. I caught my reflection in the security mirror, hollow-eyed, wearing the same jeans and flannel shirt I'd put on 3 days ago when Victoria's call shattered my world. I looked like exactly what I was. A woman with nothing left to lose, determined to fight her way to the one place she needed to be. 3 months earlier, I'd been Olive Stone, happily married woman living in a converted barn outside Boulder, Colorado. Marcus and I had transformed that old structure into something magical. Exposed wooden beams, mason jar lights strung across the ceiling, my paintings covering every available wall space. We'd found it for a song because nobody else could see past the peeling paint and broken windows. But Marcus had vision. He always had vision. "This place has good bones, Ollie," he'd said the first time we walked through it, his calloused hands running along the weathered wood. "We could make something beautiful here." That was Marcus in a nutshell. Where other people saw problems, he saw possibilities. Where I saw my own self-doubt and insecurities, he saw an artist worth believing in. He'd convinced me to quit my soul-crushing job at the insurance company and focus on my painting full-time, something I'd dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. "Life's too short to spend it doing work that makes you miserable," he'd argued, pulling me close in our kitchen while coffee percolated on the stove. "You've got talent, baby. Real talent. Let me support us while you figure out how to share it with the world." Marcus worked construction. 12-hour days in the Colorado sun building custom homes for wealthy transplants from California. His hands were always rough, his back perpetually sore, but he never complained. Every evening he'd come home dusty and exhausted, but his face would light up when he saw whatever new piece I'd been working on. "Show me what you created today," became his daily greeting, and I'd walk him through my latest canvas, explaining my color choices or the emotion I was trying to capture. He'd listen with the same intensity other people reserved for discussing stocks or politics, asking thoughtful questions that helped me see my own work more clearly. Our relationship had started unconventionally. I'd been waitressing at a diner in downtown Boulder, trying to save money for art supplies, and feeling sorry for myself about turning 25, with nothing to show for it but a liberal arts degree and a mounting pile of student loan debt. Marcus came in every Tuesday morning before work, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, scrambled eggs over easy. He was polite but quiet, leaving generous tips and never making conversation beyond "please" and "thank you." I assumed he was married or uninterested, so I treated him like any other regular customer. It took 3 months of Tuesday mornings before he finally worked up the courage to ask me out. "I know this might be forward," he'd said, his usual confidence replaced by an endearing nervousness, "but would you maybe want to get dinner sometime? Somewhere nicer than this place, where you don't have to work?" I'd said yes primarily because he seemed genuinely kind, and kindness had been in short supply in my dating life up to that point. I hadn't expected to fall completely in love with him before our appetizers arrived. Marcus had a way of making me feel seen that I'd never experienced before. Not just noticed or appreciated, but truly seen. All my quirks and dreams and fears acknowledged and accepted. When I told him about my paintings, he didn't give me the usual patronizing encouragement about pursuing art as a hobby. Instead, he asked to see my work, spent an hour studying each piece, and told me honestly which ones moved him and why. "You've got something special, Ollie," he'd said that first night in my cramped studio apartment, surrounded by canvases. I'd been too insecure to show anyone else. "This isn't just pretty pictures. You're saying something important here." We moved in together after 6 months, married after 2 years in a small ceremony at the barn we'd renovated together. It wasn't a fancy wedding. Just us, my parents who'd driven down from Wyoming, and Marcus's best friend Jake serving as best man. Marcus had mentioned that his family lived in Georgia, but when I'd asked about inviting them, his expression had darkened. "My family and I don't really see eye to eye on much," he'd said, changing the subject quickly. "This day is about us starting our own family." I hadn't pushed the issue. Everyone had complicated family dynamics, and Marcus was clearly uncomfortable discussing his. Besides, I was too happy planning our small, perfect wedding to worry about people who weren't going to be there anyway. Looking back now, I realized how little Marcus had actually told me about his past. I knew he'd grown up in Savannah, that his father had died when he was 15, that he'd left Georgia right after high school and never looked back. But the details were always vague, glossed over with comments about wanting to focus on our future instead of dwelling on the past. "Family isn't just about blood," he told me one evening as we painted the barn's exterior walls together. "It's about choosing people who make your life better. You make my life better, Ollie. You're all the family I need." It had sounded romantic at the time. Now, standing in a truck stop bathroom trying to clean 3 days of travel grime off my face with paper towels and hand soap, it felt like another piece of a puzzle I'd never known I was supposed to be solving. The call had come on a Tuesday morning while I was painting. I'd been working on a series inspired by the view from our bedroom window, the way morning light caught the peaks of the Rockies and turned them gold. My phone had been buzzing for 10 minutes before I finally paused to answer it, paintbrush still in my hand. "Is this Olive Stone?" The woman's voice was crisp, professional, with a thick southern accent. "Yes, this is Olive. This is Victoria Whitmore, Marcus's sister. I'm calling with some very difficult news." Sister. Marcus had never mentioned having a sister named Victoria. He'd been vague about siblings, giving me the impression that he was essentially alone in the world, except for some distant relatives he wasn't close to. "I'm sorry, I think there might be some confusion," I'd said. "My husband Marcus Stone doesn't have a sister named Victoria." "Mrs. Stone." Her voice had turned cold, impatient. "Marcus died yesterday of a massive heart attack at a construction site in Denver. I'm calling to inform you about funeral arrangements." The paintbrush had slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor and leaving a streak of yellow across the canvas. "That's impossible. Marcus is at work. He kissed me goodbye this morning." "Ma'am, I understand this is shocking, but I need you to listen carefully. The funeral will be..."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Held this Saturday at Whitmore Family Chapel in Savannah. It's a private service for family only. I trust you'll respect our wishes for privacy during this difficult time. Family only. The words had hit me like a physical blow. I was Marcus's wife, his next of kin, his emergency contact on every form and document. How could his funeral be family only when I was his family? "I don't understand," I'd managed to say. "I'm his wife. I need to be there." "Mrs. Stone, I'm going to be direct with you because I think it's kinder in the long run. Marcus left Savannah for good reasons. His marriage to you was complicated for our family. The funeral arrangements have already been made, and they don't include you. I suggest you hold your own memorial service in Colorado." Hold my own memorial service. As if Marcus belonged to them instead of to me. As if 3 years of marriage could be erased by geography and family disapproval I'd never even known existed. "You can't do that," I'd said, my voice rising. "He's my husband. I have legal rights. Mrs. Stone, Georgia law is complicated when it comes to out-of-state marriages and family burial traditions. I'd advise you not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. Marcus is coming home to be buried with his father, where he belongs." She'd hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my studio holding a dead phone and trying to process the impossible. Marcus was gone, and somehow I wasn't welcome at his funeral. I'd spent the next hour calling everyone I could think of: the Denver police, the construction company Marcus worked for, the hospital where he'd been taken. Each conversation confirmed the nightmare Victoria had delivered. Marcus Stone, 28 years old, had suffered a fatal heart attack while operating a crane. He'd been dead before the paramedics arrived. The construction foreman, a gruff man named Bill who'd worked with Marcus for 2 years, had been kind but matter-of-fact. He was a good worker, Mrs. Stone. Never missed a day, always willing to stay late. Talked about you all the time, showed us pictures of your paintings. Said his wife was going to be famous someday. Did he ever mention family in Georgia? I'd asked. Bill had paused. Can't say that he did. Talked about you? Talked about that barn you two fixed up. Far as I knew, you were all the family he had. But apparently, that wasn't true. Somewhere in Georgia, there were Whitmores who claimed Marcus as their own and considered me an intruder. People who'd made decisions about his burial without consulting his wife, who'd dismissed 3 years of marriage as if it were a teenage fling instead of a life built together. I'd called Victoria back 6 times that first day, getting her voicemail each time. Finally, she'd answered, her tone even colder than before. Mrs. Stone, I thought I made myself clear. I need to understand what's happening, I'd said. Marcus never mentioned you or any family conflicts. I don't understand why I'm not welcome at my own husband's funeral. Marcus made certain choices when he left Savannah. Choices that hurt a lot of people. His marriage to you was part of that pattern of behavior. What pattern of behavior? What are you talking about? I'm not going to relitigate family history with someone who wasn't part of it. The arrangements are made. The service is Saturday at 2 o'clock. It's closed to anyone who isn't immediate family. I am immediate family. I'm his wife. You're someone he married in Colorado without telling anyone here. That's very different from being family. The casual cruelty of that statement had taken my breath away. Someone he married. As if our wedding had been a weekend whim instead of the most important day of both our lives. I tried one more approach. Please, I loved him. I just want to say goodbye. I'm sure you did love him in your way. But this isn't about you, Mrs. Stone. This is about bringing Marcus home to rest with his father, where he should have been all along. I'd appreciate it if you'd respect that. She'd hung up again, and this time when I called back, my number went straight to voicemail without ringing. That evening, I'd sat in our barn surrounded by Marcus's things. His work boots by the door, his coffee mug in the sink, the book he'd been reading still open on his nightstand, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Somewhere in Georgia, people who shared his DNA were planning a funeral that excluded his wife. They were making decisions about his body, his burial, his final goodbye as if I didn't exist. I'd pulled out our wedding photos, studying Marcus's face for clues I might have missed. He looked happy, genuinely joyful, as we exchanged vows in front of our small group of witnesses. There was no shadow of family conflict in his expression, no hint that he was harboring secrets about who he'd left behind in Georgia. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little concrete information Marcus had ever shared about his past. I knew he'd grown up in Savannah, that his mother had died when he was young, that his father had passed away during his teenage years. I knew he'd left Georgia at 18 and worked his way west, picking up construction skills and settling eventually in Colorado. But names, dates, specific stories, those had been conspicuously absent from our conversations. I don't like dwelling on sad things, he'd say whenever I asked for details. The past is the past, Ollie. What matters is what we're building together now. I'd found it romantic, this man who lived so fully in the present that yesterday's troubles couldn't touch him. Now it felt like he'd been deliberately keeping me at arm's length from an entire portion of his life. The next morning, I'd called a lawyer in Boulder to ask about my rights as Marcus's spouse. The consultation had been brief and discouraging. Mrs. Stone, you're absolutely correct that as his wife, you have legal standing regarding burial decisions. However, if the family is determined to exclude you and they have possession of the body, your options are limited. You could file an injunction, but that would take weeks and significant legal fees. By the time it was resolved, the funeral would be long over. What about after? Could I have him moved? Theoretically, yes, but again, it would be expensive and complicated. The family could contest it, especially if they argue that he'd expressed wishes to be buried in the family plot. Do you have any documentation of his burial preferences? I didn't. We'd never discussed death because we'd been young and in love and convinced we had decades ahead of us. The lawyer had been sympathetic but realistic about my options. My advice would be to try to work something out with the family. Perhaps they'd allow you to attend the service or hold a separate memorial afterward. Fighting them in court will be costly and painful, and it won't bring your husband back. But I'd already tried reasoning with Victoria, and she'd made her position clear. I wasn't family. I wasn't welcome. Marcus belonged to them now, and I was just someone who'd temporarily borrowed him. That night, lying alone in the bed Marcus and I had shared for 3 years, I'd made a decision that would have terrified me under any other circumstances. I was going to Georgia. If they wouldn't let me attend the funeral as his wife, maybe I could at least be there as a stranger paying respects. Maybe I could find a way to say goodbye, even if it had to be from a distance. I'd calculated the cost of a last-minute flight to Savannah and felt my heart sink. $800 I didn't have, especially with Marcus's final paycheck still processing and funeral expenses I hadn't even begun to consider. I'd checked bus schedules and found something more manageable. A Greyhound ticket for $320 that would get me to Georgia in 36 hours. But even that was more than I could afford. After paying our monthly bills and buying groceries, I had exactly $187 in our checking account. Not enough for a bus ticket, let alone gas and food for the trip. That's when I'd remembered something Marcus used to say about his early days traveling west. Thumb and a plum and a smile will get you anywhere in America, Ollie, as long as you're not afraid of adventure. I'd never hitchhiked in my life. The idea of climbing into strangers' cars and trusting them to get me safely across the country should have been terrifying. But sitting in our empty barn, surrounded by the life Marcus and I had built together, the prospect of missing his funeral was more frightening than any danger I might encounter on the road. I'd packed light, just a duffel bag with a change of clothes, some granola bars, a water bottle, and every dollar I could scrape together. I'd left a note for our landlord explaining that I'd be gone for a week and asking him to keep an eye on the place. I'd called my parents in Wyoming to let them know what was happening, though I'd been vague about the family conflict and my travel plans. "Honey, maybe you should just let them handle the funeral," my mother had said gently. "I know it's hard, but sometimes it's better not to force yourself into situations where you're not wanted." Not wanted. The phrase had stung because it was accurate. Marcus's family didn't want me there, but wanting had nothing to do with it. I needed to be there. I needed to see his casket, to hear whatever words were spoken over his body, to witness the final goodbye even if I couldn't participate in it. Thursday morning, I'd locked up the barn and started walking east on Highway 36, my thumb extended to passing traffic. The first car that stopped was driven by a middle-aged woman named Carol, who was heading to Denver for her daughter's college graduation. "You look like you're running towards something important," she'd said as I climbed into her passenger seat. "I'm trying to get to my husband's funeral," I'd replied, and she'd driven me all the way to Denver without asking any more questions. From Denver, I'd caught a ride with a long-haul trucker named Pete, who was delivering furniture to Dallas. He'd let me sleep in his cab while he drove through the night, waking me up at truck stops to make sure I ate something and stayed hydrated. "My daughter's about your age," he'd explained when I'd tried to thank him for his kindness. I'd hoped somebody would look out for her if she ever found herself in a situation like this. In Dallas, I'd found a ride with a college kid named Jamie who was driving to Atlanta for a job interview. She'd been curious about my story, and I'd found myself sharing more than I'd intended about Marcus and the family that didn't want me at his funeral. "That's messed up," Jamie had said bluntly. "I don't care what kind of family drama there was. You're his wife. You should be able to say goodbye." From Atlanta, I'd caught my final ride with a long-haul trucker heading to Savannah with a load of paper products. He'd been quiet for most of the drive, but as we'd approached the city limits, he'd turned to me with concern. "You got a plan for when you get there? Place to stay? Way to get around?" I'd realized I didn't. In my desperation to reach Georgia, I hadn't thought beyond the goal of arriving in time for the funeral. I had $43 left, no return transportation arranged, and no idea where I'd sleep that night. "I'll figure it out," I'd said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He dropped me off at a gas station on the outskirts of Savannah, with directions to the city center and a business card for a cheap motel that might have rooms available. As his truck pulled away, I'd stood in the parking lot with my duffel bag, breathing humid Georgia air, and trying to process that I'd actually made it. I was in Savannah. Somewhere in this city, Marcus's body was lying in Whitmore Family Chapel. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, there would be a funeral I wasn't invited to attend. But I was here, and that felt like a victory even if I wasn't sure what came next. The gas station attendant had given me directions to downtown Savannah and told me about a city bus that ran every hour. As I'd waited for the next bus, I'd called information and asked for the address of Whitmore Family Chapel. The operator had connected me, and I'd listened to a recorded message about services and visiting hours. The Whitmore family has been serving Savannah's funeral needs for over 60 years, the recording had announced. "We specialize in traditional services that honor both the departed and the families who loved them." Traditional services. The phrase had made me think about Victoria's insistence that Marcus was coming home to be buried where he belonged. As if Colorado had been a temporary detour instead of the place he'd chosen to build his adult life. The bus ride into downtown Savannah had been surreal. Spanish moss dripped from ancient oak trees, and historic mansions lined the streets like something from a movie set. It was beautiful in a way that felt completely foreign to the rugged landscapes of Colorado I'd grown accustomed to. This was the world Marcus had grown up in, the place he'd chosen to leave behind. I'd found a room at a rundown motel near the bus station for $35 a night, leaving me with enough money for minimal food and, hopefully, bus fare home if I could figure out a way to earn some cash. The room was small and smelled like old cigarettes, but it had a bed and a shower, which was all I needed. That evening, I'd walked through downtown Savannah, trying to understand what Marcus's life might have been like here. The historic district was gorgeous, full of tourists and horse-drawn carriages and restaurants that looked too expensive for me to even walk past. But the further I'd gotten from the tourist areas, the more I'd seen neighborhoods that looked worn down, forgotten. I'd found Whitmore Family Chapel on a quiet street, lined with old churches and antique shops. It was an imposing brick building with tall white columns and a sign announcing that services for Marcus Edmund Whitmore would be held Saturday at 2 o'clock. Family and invited guests only. Marcus Edmund Whitmore. Even his name was different here. In Colorado, he'd been Marcus Stone, taking my last name when we'd married because he'd said it represented a fresh start for both of us. Now I discovered his real surname, the one he'd abandoned when he'd left Georgia. I'd stood on the sidewalk across from the chapel, staring at his name on the sign, and trying to reconcile this Marcus Whitmore with the Marcus Stone I'd married. Who was this man I'd thought I knew so completely? What had happened in Savannah that made him willing to change his name and cut ties with his entire family? A woman had emerged from the chapel as I'd stood there, middle-aged, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a black dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. She'd locked the door behind her and started walking toward a luxury sedan parked at the curb. Something about her bearing, the authoritative way she'd moved, had made me think this might be Victoria. I'd crossed the street before I could lose my nerve. "Excuse me," I'd called. "Are you Victoria Whitmore?" She'd turned, her eyes narrowing as she'd looked me up and down. I'd suddenly been conscious of my wrinkled clothes, my unwashed hair, the 3 days of travel wear that marked me as clearly out of place in this refined neighborhood. "Yes, I'm Victoria Whitmore. And you are?" "I'm Olive Stone, Marcus's wife." Her expression had shifted from polite curiosity to cold recognition. "Mrs. Stone, I thought I made it clear that you weren't welcome here." "I needed to see where the service will be held. I needed to be close to him, even if I can't be inside." Victoria had studied me for a long moment, and I'd seen something that might have been sympathy flicker across her features before hardening back into resolve. "Mrs. Stone, I understand you're grieving, but your presence here is only going to cause more pain for everyone involved." Marcus made his choices when he left Savannah. Those choices had consequences. What choices? What happened here that was so terrible he felt like he had to disappear? That's not your story to know. It's ours, and it's private. He was my husband. Doesn't that give me any right to understand who he was? Victoria had looked away, her jaw tightening. Mrs. Stone, I'm going to tell you something because I think it might help you move forward. Marcus ran away from Savannah because he couldn't face the responsibilities he had here. He hurt people. Badly. And instead of dealing with the consequences like a man, he disappeared. The fact that he built a life in Colorado doesn't erase what he did here. What did he do? He caused a death, Mrs. Stone. Someone died because of Marcus's poor judgment, and instead of staying to face that reality, he ran away like a coward. The words had hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, responsible for someone's death? It seemed impossible. The man I'd married was gentle, thoughtful, incapable of harming anyone. I don't believe you. I don't particularly care what you believe. The fact remains that Marcus left a lot of broken people behind when he ran off to Colorado. Some wounds don't heal just because time passes. Victoria had gotten into her car then, rolling down the window for one final comment. If you really love Marcus the way you claim to, you'll let him rest in peace with his family. Don't make tomorrow harder than it needs to be. She'd driven away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that everything I'd thought I knew about my husband had been carefully curated to hide darker truths. I'd walked back to my motel room as the sun set over Savannah, Spanish moss swaying in the evening breeze, and the sound of church bells echoing across the historic district. Tomorrow, there would be a funeral. Victoria had made it clear I wasn't welcome inside, but she couldn't stop me from being in the same city, breathing the same air as the man I'd loved. As I'd lain in the lumpy motel bed that night, listening to traffic and voices from the street below, I'd thought about Marcus's hands in my hair, as he'd told me I was all the family he needed. Had those words been true, or had they been part of an elaborate construction designed to keep me from asking too many questions about the life he'd left behind? Tomorrow, I'd learn whether love was strong enough to overcome locked doors and family secrets. Tomorrow, I'd find out what happened when someone who'd been written out of the story insisted on being part of the ending anyway. The morning of Marcus's funeral dawned gray and humid, with thick clouds promising rain by afternoon. I woke up in my cramped motel room at 6:30, my body aching from the cheap mattress and my mind immediately flooding with the reality of what this day would bring. Somewhere across town, Victoria Whitmore and her family were preparing for a service I'd been explicitly banned from attending. I showered in the tiny bathroom, letting hot water wash away 3 days of travel grime while I tried to decide what to wear to a funeral I couldn't enter. I'd packed one dress, a simple black cotton piece I'd worn to Marcus's work Christmas party last year. He'd told me I looked beautiful in it, spinning me around our kitchen and humming along to whatever jazz standard was playing on the radio. "Save me a dance at the party," he'd said, kissing my neck while I'd tried to apply mascara in our hallway mirror. "It's not that kind of party, Marcus. It's dinner at a steakhouse with your coworkers. Every party is that kind of party if you're with the right person." Now I was putting on that same dress to say goodbye to him, alone in a motel room 800 miles from home while his family prepared to bury him as if I'd never existed. The motel's continental breakfast was a sad affair. Stale donuts, watery coffee, and orange juice that tasted more like sugar water than fruit. I forced myself to eat a banana and drink 2 cups of coffee, knowing I'd need energy for whatever this day brought. The other guests looked like travelers passing through, people with places to go, and purposes that made sense. I felt like an imposter among them, a woman with no clear plan beyond showing up where I wasn't wanted. At 9 o'clock, I called a taxi to take me across town to Whitmore Family Chapel. The driver was an elderly black man named Curtis who studied me in his rearview mirror as I gave him the address. "You going to a service at Whitmore's?" he asked as we pulled away from the motel. "Yes. Family or friend?" I paused, unsure how to answer. "It's complicated." Curtis nodded knowingly. "Whitmore family's been complicated for generations. Old Savannah money, you know. Lots of history, not all of it pretty." "Do you know them personally?" "Know of them. Been driving cab in this city for 37 years. You hear things. Pick up pieces of stories. The Whitmores own half the historic district, got their fingers in most of the businesses that matter. But money don't solve everything, especially when it comes to family." "What kind of things do you hear?" Curtis glanced at me again in the mirror. "You sure you want to know? Sometimes ignorance is kinder than truth. I need to know. He was quiet for several blocks, navigating through morning traffic while he seemed to consider how much to share with a stranger. Finally, he spoke carefully. The Whitmore boy who died, that was Edmund's son, right? Marcus? Yes. Heard he ran off years ago after some kind of trouble. Left town real sudden-like, never came back. Family didn't talk about him much after that, but word was there'd been some kind of accident. Someone got hurt bad. My stomach clenched. Victoria's words from yesterday echoed in my mind. He caused a death, Mrs. Stone. What kind of accident? Can't say for certain. Might have been a car wreck, might have been something else. But the family closed ranks after it happened, and the boy disappeared. Haven't heard his name mentioned in Savannah for years until this week. We pulled up in front of the chapel, and Curtis turned to face me directly. Miss, I don't know what your connection is to this family, but be careful. The Whitmores got long memories and short tempers when it comes to protecting their reputation. If you're here stirring up old trouble, you might not like what you find. I paid him and stepped out onto the sidewalk, his warning ringing in my ears. The chapel looked even more imposing in daylight, its brick facade and white columns speaking of old money and older traditions. A steady stream of well-dressed people was entering through the main doors, all of them moving with the quiet solemnity appropriate for a funeral. I positioned myself across the street under the awning of an antique shop, close enough to see everyone who entered but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. For 2 hours, I watched Savannah's elite pay their respects to a man they'd known as Marcus Whitmore, someone completely different from the Marcus Stone I'd married. The mourners were everything I'd expected from Victoria's description of old Savannah money. Women in expensive black dresses and pearl necklaces, men in perfectly tailored suits, everyone moving with the practiced grace of people accustomed to formal occasions. They greeted each other with the kind of familiarity that came from decades of shared social circles, whispered conversations that suggested long histories and complex relationships. At 11:30, a black limousine pulled up in front of the chapel. Victoria emerged first, followed by an elderly woman who had to be Marcus's grandmother, and a man in his 40s who shared Marcus's dark hair and strong jawline. This had to be immediate family, the people who'd known Marcus before he became my husband. As they walked toward the chapel entrance, Victoria's eyes scanned the street and landed directly on me. Even from across the street, I could see her expression harden. She said something to the man beside her, who turned to look in my direction with obvious displeasure. I held my ground, meeting Victoria's stare with determination I didn't entirely feel. I had as much right to be on this public street as anyone else, even if I couldn't enter the building where my husband's body lay. The service began at 2 o'clock exactly. I could hear organ music drifting from the chapel, hymns I didn't recognize played with formal precision. Occasionally, voices would join in song, a congregation honoring someone they'd known in ways I never would. Around 2:30, a man approached me from across the street. He was tall and lean with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious. Unlike the other mourners, he walked directly toward me with purposeful intent. "You must be Olive," he said when he reached me. "I'm Dr. James Richardson. I was Marcus's family physician when he was growing up." I wasn't sure how to respond. Had Victoria sent him to convince me to leave? "I saw you from inside the chapel," he continued. "Victoria pointed you out as Marcus's wife from Colorado. I asked if I could speak with you privately." "Are you here to tell me to go home?" Dr. Richardson smiled sadly. "Actually, I was hoping you might be able to answer some questions for me. About Marcus. About the man he became after he left Savannah." "What kind of questions?" "Walk with me for a moment." We strolled down the quiet street, moving away from the chapel but staying within earshot of the service. Dr. Richardson kept his hands clasped behind his back, choosing his words carefully. "I delivered Marcus when he was born. Watched him grow up, treated his childhood illnesses, knew him as well as anyone outside his immediate family. When he disappeared 10 years ago, it broke my heart. Not just because of what happened, but because I knew the guilt would eat him alive if he didn't find a way to make peace with it." "What did happen?" Victoria mentioned an accident. Someone dying, but she wouldn't give me details. Dr. Richardson stopped walking and turned to face me. Marcus didn't tell you about Lily? Who's Lily? The pain that crossed his features made my chest tighten. Whatever this story was, it was worse than I'd imagined. Lily Chen was Marcus's girlfriend when he was 18. They'd been together since sophomore year of high school, planned to get married after graduation. She was the kind of girl who made everyone around her better. Smart, funny, kind to everyone, regardless of their social status. Marcus was crazy about her. I felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which seemed ridiculous under the circumstances. Of course, Marcus had dated other people before me. But the way Dr. Richardson spoke about this, Lily, with such obvious affection and loss, suggested she'd been more than just a teenage romance. What happened to her? Graduation night, May 2014. Marcus and Lily were at a party at the Whitmore estate, celebrating with their classmates. Marcus had been drinking, not heavily, but enough that he shouldn't have been driving. Lily asked him to take her home around midnight because she had to work early the next morning. My heart was already sinking, anticipating the trajectory of this story. They never made it to Lily's house. Marcus took a curve too fast on River Road and lost control. The car went through the guardrail and down the embankment into the marsh. Marcus was thrown clear, ended up with a broken arm and some bruises. Lily... He paused, struggling with the words. Lily was trapped inside when the car went underwater. By the time emergency responders pulled her out, it was too late. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Marcus, my gentle husband, who'd never so much as raised his voice in anger, had caused someone's death. A girl he'd loved, someone's daughter, a life cut short because of his poor judgment. The official investigation ruled it an accident. Dr. Richardson continued. Marcus's blood alcohol was just under the legal limit. The road was known to be dangerous in wet conditions. There were multiple factors involved. But officially legal and emotionally devastating are two very different things. What happened afterward? Marcus fell apart completely. Stopped eating, stopped sleeping, couldn't function. Lily's parents were destroyed, as you might imagine. The community was divided between those who supported Marcus and those who blamed him entirely. The Whitmore family closed ranks, hired the best lawyers, made sure Marcus faced minimal legal consequences. But he couldn't live with it. No, he couldn't. 3 months after the accident, he disappeared. Left a note saying he couldn't stay in a place where everything reminded him of what he'd done, that he needed to find a way to build a life that honored Lily's memory, instead of being a constant reminder of her death. We walked in silence for several minutes while I processed this information. The Marcus I'd known had been haunted by something, I realize now. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out our bedroom window with an expression of profound sadness, but when I'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd always deflect with a smile and a change of subject. Did he ever try to contact anyone here after he left? Not that I know of. Victoria mentioned that they'd hired private investigators to find him over the years, but Marcus had changed his name and seemed determined to disappear completely. When she called me yesterday to say he'd died, that he'd been married and living in Colorado, I was shocked. I'd always hoped he'd found peace somewhere, but I never expected to hear he'd built an entire new life. Victoria seems to think he was a coward for leaving. Dr. Richardson considered this carefully. Victoria loved her brother, but she's also a Whitmore, and Whitmores don't run from problems. They face them head-on, consequences be damned. She couldn't understand why Marcus felt like he had to disappear, instead of staying to rebuild his life here. But you understood? I understood that an 18-year-old boy who'd caused the death of the girl he loved might not be capable of rational decision-making. I understood that sometimes people need to reinvent themselves completely in order to survive trauma. What I never understood was why he never came back, why he never tried to make amends. The organ music from the chapel had stopped, replaced by the sound of a single voice speaking. Someone was delivering a eulogy for Marcus, sharing memories and stories I'd never heard. Dr. Richardson, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Victoria is right to exclude me from the service? Do you think I don't belong here? He was quiet for a long moment. studying my face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making difficult assessments. "I think," he said finally, "that you knew a version of Marcus that we never got to see. You knew the man he became after he'd spent 10 years learning to live with his mistakes. That man, the one who married you and built a life in Colorado, might have been closer to who Marcus was always meant to be than the boy we knew here. But Victoria doesn't see it that way. Victoria sees a brother who abandoned his family when they needed him most. She sees someone who left other people to clean up his mess while he started over somewhere else. She's not wrong about those things, but she's not entirely right either." The chapel doors opened, and mourners began emerging into the gray afternoon. The service was over, which meant Marcus's casket would soon be transported to the family cemetery for burial. Victoria had made it clear I wasn't welcome there either, but I couldn't bear the thought of not witnessing this final goodbye. "Dr. Richardson, where is the family cemetery?" "Bonaventure Cemetery, about 15 minutes from here." "But Olive—" He paused, clearly struggling with whether to say more. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." Victoria was quite firm about wanting privacy for the burial. "I can't just let them bury him without saying goodbye. He was my husband for 3 years. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts for everything. But pushing your way into a situation where you're not wanted might do more harm than good." I watched as Victoria and her family emerged from the chapel, followed by pallbearers carrying a mahogany casket that contained the man I'd loved. Marcus was in there, dressed in a suit I'd probably never seen, surrounded by flowers chosen by people who'd known him before I existed. "I have to try," I said to Dr. Richardson. "I traveled 2,000 miles to be here. I can't give up now." He nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "If you're determined to go, at least let me drive you. It'll be safer than trying to find your own way. And maybe I can help smooth things over if there's a confrontation." We drove to Bonaventure Cemetery in Dr. Richardson's sedan, following the funeral procession at a respectful distance. He told me more about Marcus's childhood during the drive, painting a picture of a boy who'd been sensitive and thoughtful even before tragedy changed his life. "He was always the one who brought home stray animals," Dr. Richardson said as we passed through Savannah's historic district. "Marcus couldn't stand to see anything suffering. Victoria used to tease him about being too soft-hearted for his own good. That sounds like the Marcus I knew. The accident didn't change his essential nature. It just gave him something to feel guilty about for the rest of his life. I've always believed that's why he left. Not because he was a coward, but because staying in Savannah meant being constantly reminded of the worst thing he'd ever done." Bonaventure Cemetery was unlike any burial ground I'd ever seen. Ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss created a canopy over weathered headstones and elaborate mausoleums, giving the entire place an otherworldly atmosphere. We parked near the entrance and walked toward the sound of voices gathered around an open grave. The Whitmore family plot was in the oldest section of the cemetery, marked by a large granite monument bearing the family name and dates stretching back to the 1800s. Marcus's casket sat suspended over a freshly dug grave next to a smaller headstone marked Edmund Whitmore, 1965 to 2010, beloved father. About 30 people had gathered for the burial, a smaller group than had attended the chapel service. Victoria stood at the head of the grave with the elderly woman I'd assumed was Marcus's grandmother, both of them holding white roses. A minister was reading from a prayer book, his words carried away by the Spanish moss-filtered breeze. Dr. Richardson and I positioned ourselves behind a large oak tree about 50 yards away, close enough to hear the service but far enough to avoid immediate detection. For 20 minutes we listened as family members and close friends shared final words about Marcus Whitmore, the boy they'd known before he became Marcus Stone. Victoria stepped forward when the minister finished his prayers, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery. "Marcus was complicated," she began, her composure wavering slightly. "He was brilliant and kind and infuriating in equal measure. He made mistakes that hurt people, including himself, and he never figured out how to forgive himself for them." She paused, looking down at the casket with an expression of profound loss. I was angry at him for leaving us, angry that he disappeared when we needed him most, angry that he built a new life somewhere else while we were left to deal with the consequences of his choices. But I loved him, and I never stopped hoping he'd find his way home. Victoria's voice broke on the last words, and the elderly woman beside her reached out to take her hand. It was the first crack I'd seen in Victoria's composed facade, and it reminded me that whatever family conflict had driven Marcus away, these people had genuinely loved him too. The minister said a final prayer, and mourners began taking turns dropping roses onto the casket before it was lowered into the ground. I watched from behind our tree as Marcus disappeared into Georgia soil, surrounded by family members whose grief was as real as mine, even if it was complicated by years of anger and abandonment. As the crowd began to disperse, Victoria looked directly toward our hiding spot. She said something to the man I'd assumed was her brother, and both of them started walking in our direction. "She spotted us," Dr. Richardson murmured. "This might get unpleasant." Victoria approached with determined strides, her black dress stark against the moss-draped trees. Her face was flushed with a combination of grief and anger that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had during our previous encounters. "Mrs. Stone," she said when she reached us, "I thought I made it clear that you weren't welcome here." "I needed to see him buried," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye." "You've said goodbye. Now please, leave us to grieve in peace." "Victoria," Dr. Richardson interjected gently, "perhaps this isn't the time or place for this conversation." "With respect, Dr. Richardson, this woman has inserted herself into our family's tragedy without invitation. I'm trying to handle this as diplomatically as possible. I'm not trying to insert myself into anything," I said. "I'm trying to understand why my husband felt like he had to hide his entire past from me. I'm trying to figure out who Marcus really was." Victoria's expression hardened. Marcus was someone who ran away from his responsibilities. Someone who caused a death and then disappeared rather than face the consequences like a man. He was also someone who spent 10 years building a life dedicated to making things better instead of worse. I replied, feeling anger rise in my chest. He was someone who worked construction building homes for families, who encouraged my art when I didn't believe in myself, who made me feel loved and supported every single day we were together. Pretty words, Mrs. Stone, but they don't bring Lily Chen back to life. The name hit me like a slap. Until now, Lily had been an abstraction, a tragic figure from Marcus's past. But hearing Victoria speak her name with such venom made the reality of Marcus's guilt suddenly concrete. "I know about Lily," I said quietly. "Dr. Richardson told me what happened." "Did he tell you that Lily was valedictorian of their graduating class? That she'd been accepted to medical school, that she planned to come back to Savannah and work with underserved communities? Did he tell you that she volunteered at the Children's Hospital every weekend, that she tutored kids who couldn't afford private help?" Each detail felt like a physical blow. Lily hadn't just been Marcus's girlfriend. She'd been someone with plans and dreams and the potential to make the world better. "Did he tell you," Victoria continued, "that Lily's parents never recovered from losing her? That her mother still sets a place for her at dinner 10 years later? That her father drinks himself to sleep every night because he can't bear being awake without her?" "Victoria, please," Dr. Richardson said softly. "No, she wanted to understand who Marcus really was. Marcus was someone who destroyed the most beautiful person any of us had ever known, and then ran away so he wouldn't have to watch her parents fall apart." I felt tears streaming down my face, but I forced myself to speak. "And what would have happened if he'd stayed? Would that have brought Lily back? Would his suffering have made anyone feel better? It would have shown that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. It would have demonstrated that he cared about something other than his own guilt. Maybe he left because he cared too much. Maybe he knew that seeing him every day would make it harder for everyone to heal." Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not agreement, but perhaps a flicker of recognition that the situation might be more complicated than she'd allowed herself to consider. "Mrs. Stone," she said finally, "I can see that you loved my brother. I can see that he built something meaningful with you in Colorado. But loving someone doesn't erase the damage they've caused. No, it doesn't. But it also doesn't mean they don't deserve a chance at redemption. We stood in the cemetery surrounded by ancient trees and weathered headstones, three people trying to make sense of loss and guilt, and the complicated ways people survive trauma. The afternoon was growing darker, and I could hear thunder rumbling in the distance. Victoria looked back toward the grave where workers had begun filling in the dirt over Marcus's casket. When she turned back to me, her expression had softened slightly. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "Something that might help you understand why this has been so difficult for our family." I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to share would change my understanding of the situation yet again. Marcus didn't just run away after Lily died. He tried to contact her parents several times in the months before he left. He wanted to apologize, to take responsibility, to find some way to make amends. But Lily's father, he threatened Marcus, said if he ever saw him again, he'd kill him with his bare hands. This was news that complicated the narrative Victoria had been constructing about Marcus's cowardice. The last time Marcus tried to approach the Chen family, Mr. Chen chased him off their property with a baseball bat. Marcus came home bloody and terrified, saying he couldn't stay in a town where half the people wanted him dead. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it doesn't change anything." Marcus still chose to leave, instead of finding another way to live with what he'd done. He still abandoned his family when we needed him. But it did change things, at least for me. The Marcus I'd known had been gentle and thoughtful, someone who agonized over even small mistakes. Learning that he'd tried to make amends, that he'd been driven away by threats of violence, painted his disappearance in a very different light. Dr. Richardson checked his watch. "The weather's turning nasty. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable." As if summoned by his words, the first fat raindrops began falling through the Spanish moss canopy. Within minutes, it was a steady downpour, sending mourners hurrying toward their cars and turning the cemetery paths into muddy streams. Victoria looked at me one more time, rain plastering her carefully styled hair against her head. "Mrs. Stone, if you're determined to understand Marcus's story, there's someone you should meet. Someone who might be able to give you answers. I can't." She handed me a business card that was already getting soggy in the rain. "This is Lily's sister, Grace. She lives here in Savannah, and she's the only member of the Chen family who's ever been willing to talk about what happened that night. If you really want to know who Marcus was, she's the person you need to speak with." With that, Victoria hurried toward the waiting limousine, leaving me standing in the rain with a business card that might hold the key to understanding my husband's hidden past. Dr. Richardson drove me back to my motel through the storm, both of us quiet as we processed what had happened at the cemetery. As we pulled up in front of the dingy building, he turned to me with concern. "Olive, are you sure you want to pursue this? Sometimes the truth is more painful than the mystery." I looked at the business card Victoria had given me, now damp and smeared but still readable. Grace Chen, licensed social worker, and a local phone number. "I can't go home without understanding," I said. "I can't build the rest of my life on a foundation of half-truths and careful omissions." Dr. Richardson nodded. "If you decide to call Grace, be prepared. The Chen family's grief is still very raw, even after all these years. And Grace has her own complicated feelings about Marcus and what happened." That evening, I sat in my motel room listening to rain against the windows and staring at Grace Chen's business card. Somewhere in Savannah, this woman held pieces of Marcus's story that might help me understand the man I'd married. But calling her felt like opening a door I might not be able to close again. I thought about Marcus working in our garden, his hands gentle with seedlings as he'd helped me plant vegetables we'd never get to harvest together. I thought about the way he'd looked at my paintings, seeing beauty and meaning I'd been too insecure to recognize myself. I thought about quiet Sunday mornings in our converted barn, coffee and crossword puzzles, and the kind of contentment I'd never expected to find. That Marcus, the one who'd built a life with me in Colorado, deserved to have his story told completely. Even if that story included tragedy and guilt and mistakes that had shaped him in ways I'd never understood. At 9 o'clock, I picked up my phone and dialed Grace Chen's number, not knowing that this conversation would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, forgiveness, and the price of running from the past. Grace Chen answered on the third ring, her voice cautious in the way of someone who'd learned to be wary of unexpected phone calls. This is Grace. Ms. Chen, my name is Olive Stone. Victoria Whitmore gave me your number. I was hoping we could talk about Marcus. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Mrs. Stone. I wondered if you might call. Victoria mentioned there was a wife in Colorado who'd come to town for the funeral. I'm sorry to bother you. I know this must be difficult, but I need to understand what happened between Marcus and your family. I need to know who my husband really was. Your husband? She repeated the words as if testing their weight. It's strange to think of Marcus as someone's husband. In my mind, he's still 18 years old, still the boy who killed my sister. The bluntness of her statement took my breath away. Where Victoria had been diplomatic, even in her anger, Grace Chen was starkly direct. Would you be willing to meet with me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I've come a long way, and I'm trying to piece together Marcus's past. Grace was quiet again, and I could hear the sound of children playing in the background, laughter and voices that suggested she had a family of her own now. Mrs. Stone, can I ask you something? Of course. Did Marcus ever mention Lily? Ever talk about someone he'd lost? Someone he felt guilty about? I thought about all the times I'd caught Marcus staring out windows with that distant, pained expression. All the moments when he'd seemed to be carrying a weight I couldn't identify. Not directly, but there were signs something haunted him. He'd get this look sometimes, like he was remembering something terrible. When I'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd always change the subject. At least, he remembered her. I wasn't sure if he'd managed to forget completely. Ms. Chen, Grace, would you be willing to meet? I understand if it's too painful, but I need to know the truth about what happened that night. She sighed, and I heard her speaking to someone else in the room, muffled words about going out for coffee and being back before dinner. There's a cafe called Magnolia Moon on Bull Street. Do you know where that is? I can find it. I'll be there in an hour. I have shoulder-length black hair, and I'll be wearing a green sweater. Mrs. Stone? Yes? This conversation isn't going to be easy for either of us. Are you sure you're prepared for that? I looked around my shabby motel room, thinking about the 2,000 miles I'd traveled and the family that had tried to erase me from Marcus's story. I'm sure. The rain had stopped by the time I reached downtown Savannah, leaving the historic streets gleaming under gas lamplight. Magnolia Moon turned out to be a small, cozy place with exposed brick walls and the kind of atmosphere that encouraged quiet conversation. I arrived first and chose a corner table where we could talk without being overheard. Grace Chen walked in exactly on time, scanning the cafe until she spotted me. She was petite and elegant, with the kind of composed bearing that suggested she was accustomed to handling difficult situations professionally. As she approached my table, I could see the family resemblance to the Lily I'd imagined, but where I'd pictured someone soft and gentle, Grace had an edge of steel that spoke to hard-won strength. Mrs. Stone. She extended her hand as she sat down. Thank you for agreeing to meet somewhere neutral. I wasn't sure I could handle having this conversation in my home. Thank you for being willing to talk at all. I can't imagine how difficult this must be. Grace ordered green tea while I stuck with coffee, both of us taking our time with the ritual of ordering and settling in. Finally, she looked directly at me with dark eyes that seemed to be assessing my character. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. Lily wasn't just my sister. She was my best friend, my role model, the person who taught me what it meant to live with purpose. When she died, it nearly destroyed our entire family. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, but I didn't agree to meet with you so you could offer condolences. I agreed because I think there are things you need to know about Marcus that his family will never tell you. I leaned forward, sensing that Grace Chen was about to shatter whatever understanding I'd managed to build about my husband's past. The official story about the accident is true as far as it goes. Marcus had been drinking, he took a curve too fast, the car went into the marsh, and Lily drowned. But that's not the whole truth. What's the whole truth? Grace wrapped her hands around her tea mug, using the warmth to steady herself before continuing. Marcus and Lily had been fighting that night. Not just a little argument, but a serious fight about their future. Lily had been accepted to medical school at Emory, and Marcus wanted her to turn it down and stay in Savannah so they could get married right away. This was the first I'd heard about conflict between Marcus and Lily. Everyone else had described them as the perfect high school couple, deeply in love and planning a future together. Lily was brilliant, Mrs. Stone. Valedictorian, full scholarship, the kind of student who comes along once in a decade. She'd dreamed of becoming a doctor since she was 12 years old, and she'd worked incredibly hard to make that dream possible. But Marcus wanted her to give that up? Marcus was scared. His father had died 3 years earlier, and he'd been struggling with depression and anxiety ever since. Lily was his anchor, the one person who made him feel stable and secure. The idea of her leaving Savannah, even temporarily for medical school, terrified him. Grace paused to sip her tea, gathering herself for whatever came next. The fight started at the graduation party. Marcus had been drinking, and he kept pressuring Lily to commit to staying in Savannah. He told her they could get married that summer, that he'd get a job with his family's construction business, that they could start their life together right away. And Lily didn't want that? Lily wanted both. She wanted to marry Marcus eventually, but she also wanted to pursue her career first. She'd worked too hard to give up on medical school, especially when she'd already been accepted with a full scholarship. I could imagine the scene, two 18-year-olds trying to navigate the competing demands of love and ambition, neither of them mature enough to see beyond their immediate desires. The argument escalated throughout the evening. Marcus kept drinking, getting more and more upset about what he saw as Lily choosing her career over their relationship. Finally, Lily decided she'd had enough. She told Marcus she was ready to go home, that they could continue the discussion when he was sober. And that's when they got in the car? That's when Marcus insisted on driving her home, even though Lily asked him to call someone else or let her call her parents. She was angry about the fight, but she was also worried about him driving after drinking. Marcus wouldn't listen. He said he was fine, that he needed to take her home so they could finish their conversation. Grace's voice had gotten quieter, and I could see her struggling with the memory of her sister's final hours. According to the accident reconstruction, Marcus was driving significantly over the speed limit when he hit that curve. But here's what nobody talks about, Mrs. Stone. Here's the part that haunts me 10 years later. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a pain that time hadn't dulled. Lily wasn't wearing her seatbelt. She always wore her seatbelt, always insisted that everyone in the car buckle up before driving anywhere. But that night, she wasn't wearing it. Why not? Because she was turned sideways in her seat, still arguing with Marcus when he hit the curve. The police found evidence that she'd been reaching for the steering wheel, probably trying to get Marcus to slow down or pull over. That's why she was thrown from the car when it rolled. That's why Marcus survived and she didn't. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been responsible for an accident caused by drunk driving. He'd been driving recklessly while arguing with someone who was actively trying to get him to stop. Grace, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. The Whitmore family made sure you didn't have any idea. They hired the best lawyers in Georgia to keep the details of that night from becoming public. The official report mentions alcohol and excessive speed, but it doesn't talk about the argument or the evidence that Lily was trying to stop Marcus from driving so dangerously. Why are you telling me this now? Grace set down her tea and looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read. Because I want you to understand exactly who you married. I want you to know that Marcus didn't just make a mistake that night. He made a series of deliberate choices that led to my sister's death. But also because, she continued, I want you to know that Lily forgave him. The words seemed to contradict everything she'd just told me. How could someone forgive the person who'd caused their death? I don't understand. 3 days before she died, Lily came to my apartment. She was upset about the pressure Marcus was putting on her to give up medical school, but she was also worried about him. She said he'd been having panic attacks about her leaving, that he'd been talking about how lost he felt after his father died. Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled through until she found what she was looking for. Lily recorded a voice message for me that night. She was processing her feelings about the fight with Marcus, trying to figure out how to help him understand that loving someone didn't mean limiting their dreams. She handed me the phone with a recording queued up. I've never shared this with anyone except my parents, but I think you need to hear it. I pressed play, and suddenly Lily Chen's voice filled the space between us. Even through the phone's small speaker, I could hear the warmth and intelligence that everyone had described. Grace, I'm so confused about everything with Marcus right now. I love him, I really do, but I'm scared that he needs me in ways that aren't healthy. He's been talking about how he can't imagine living without me, how the idea of me leaving for medical school makes him feel like he's drowning. Lily's voice paused, and I could hear her sighing. I know he's struggling with his dad's death still. I know he's scared of being abandoned again. But I can't give up my entire future to make him feel secure. That's not what love is supposed to be about, right? Another pause, longer this time. I've been thinking about what you said last week, about how sometimes loving someone means helping them grow even when it's scary. I think I need to have a real conversation with Marcus about getting help for his anxiety. Maybe if he talked to someone about his fears, he could see that me going to medical school doesn't mean I'm abandoning him. The recording continued for another minute, with Lily talking about her hopes for their relationship and her determination to find a way to pursue her dreams while supporting Marcus through his emotional struggles. Her voice was filled with compassion and maturity that seemed remarkable for someone so young. When it ended, Grace and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. That was recorded on Tuesday. She died Friday night. In between, she'd started researching therapists in Savannah who specialized in grief counseling. She'd made an appointment for the following week to talk to someone about how to help Marcus work through his fears. She was trying to save him. She was trying to save their relationship. Lily believed that with the right help, Marcus could learn to support her dreams instead of seeing them as threats. She thought they could both have the futures they wanted if they just approached it the right way. The tragedy of that revelation was overwhelming. Lily had been working toward a solution that might have saved both their lives, but she'd run out of time. Grace, why are you sharing this with me? Why does it matter what Lily was thinking 3 days before she died? Because I want you to understand that my sister died trying to help the man who killed her. I want you to know that even though Marcus made terrible choices that night, Lily had already forgiven him for the fight and the pressure and the fear that was driving his behavior. But does that change anything? Does it make what happened less tragic? No, it doesn't. Lily is still dead, my parents are still destroyed, and Marcus still chose to run away, instead of facing the consequences of his actions. But it means that the last emotion my sister felt toward Marcus wasn't anger or resentment. It was love and hope for their future together. Grace pulled out a tissue and wiped her eyes, the first sign of vulnerability she'd shown since we'd started talking. Mrs. Stone, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay, did Marcus ever get help for his mental health issues? Did he ever work through whatever was driving him to be so controlling and possessive with the people he loved? I thought about my relationship with Marcus, searching for signs of the controlling behavior Grace was describing. Marcus had been supportive of my art, encouraging me to take risks and pursue my dreams. He'd never pressured me to give up my goals for the sake of our relationship. He wasn't controlling with me. If anything, he pushed me to be more ambitious, more confident in my abilities. That's what I was hoping to hear. Why? Grace leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the careful attention of someone making an important assessment. Because it suggests that Marcus learned something from what happened to Lily. It suggests that maybe her death wasn't completely meaningless if it taught him how to love someone without trying to limit them. The idea that Marcus's growth as a person might have been purchased with Lily's life was both comforting and horrifying. Had he become a better husband to me because he'd learned from the worst mistake of his life? Grace, can I ask you something? Do you think Marcus should have stayed in Savannah? Do you think running away made him a coward? She considered the question carefully, stirring her tea while she organized her thoughts. I think Marcus was 18 years old and completely unprepared to handle the magnitude of what he'd done. I think staying in Savannah might have destroyed him completely, especially with my father threatening violence and half the community treating him like a pariah. But you also think he could have found another way to take responsibility? Maybe. But honestly, Mrs. Stone, I'm not sure it matters anymore. Marcus is dead now. He's beyond judgment or redemption or any of the other things people argue about when it comes to tragic situations like this. But it matters to me. It matters to understanding who I was married to. Grace nodded. Then let me tell you what I think based on 10 years of processing my sister's death. I think Marcus was a scared, damaged boy who made catastrophic choices under the influence of alcohol and emotional instability. I think he probably would have benefited from therapy and medication and the kind of support system that might have helped him process his father's death in healthier ways. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I also think that the Marcus who married you in Colorado might have been the man my sister was hoping he could become. The Marcus who encouraged your art, who built a stable life, who learned to love without trying to control. That Marcus might have been Lily's final gift to the world. The idea that my husband's best qualities had been shaped by his worst mistakes was difficult to process. Had I fallen in love with someone who'd been transformed by tragedy? Or had I simply seen a different side of someone who'd always had the capacity for both growth and destruction? Grace, there's something else I need to ask you about. Victoria mentioned that Marcus tried to contact your family before he left Savannah, that your father threatened him. Grace's expression darkened. My father was destroyed by Lily's death. Completely, utterly destroyed. He'd been protective of Lily before the accident, but afterward he became obsessed with the idea that Marcus had gotten away with murder. Did Marcus really try to apologize? He tried. Multiple times. He called our house, sent letters, even showed up at my father's work once. But my father couldn't hear any of it. As far as he was concerned, Marcus was a rich kid whose family had bought him a get-out-of-jail-free card. Was that true? Partially. The Whitmore family did hire expensive lawyers and make sure Marcus faced minimal legal consequences. But that doesn't mean Marcus wasn't genuinely trying to take responsibility in other ways. Grace pulled out her phone again, scrolling through old emails until she found what she was looking for. Marcus sent me this email 2 weeks before he left Savannah. I never responded to it, but I kept it all these years. She handed me the phone, and I read Marcus's words from 10 years ago. Grace, I know your family doesn't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I know nothing I say can bring Lily back or make up for what I did that night. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I need you to know that I remember everything about the accident. I remember Lily trying to get me to slow down. I remember her reaching for the steering wheel. I remember her voice saying my name right before we hit the curve. I remember all of it, and I will remember it every day for the rest of my life. I'm leaving Savannah because I can't live in a place where my presence causes your family more pain. But I want you to know that I'm not running away from responsibility. I'm trying to figure out how to live with what I've done. How to build a life that honors Lily's memory, instead of being a constant reminder of her death. I don't know if I'll ever succeed, but I have to try. Please tell your parents that I'm sorry. Not because it changes anything, but because it's true. Marcus read the email twice, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, anguished young man with the controlling, possessive person Grace had described from the night of the accident. Why didn't you ever respond? Because I was 19 years old and furious and heartbroken. Because responding would have felt like betraying Lily's memory. Because I wanted Marcus to suffer the way we were suffering. Do you regret that now? Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the gaslit street beyond. I regret a lot of things about how we handled the aftermath of Lily's death. I regret that my father's anger consumed him so completely that he couldn't see past his desire for revenge. I regret that we never found a way to have a real conversation about what happened that night and what it meant for everyone involved. But do you regret not responding to Marcus specifically? I think Marcus needed to leave Savannah to become the person he was meant to be. If I'd responded to that email, if we'd found a way to have a dialogue about forgiveness and responsibility, he might have felt obligated to stay. And staying might have prevented him from growing into the man who could marry you and build a healthy relationship. The conversation was becoming almost philosophical, touching on questions about justice and redemption that didn't have clear answers. But it was also helping me understand Marcus in ways I'd never expected. Grace, can I ask you one more difficult question? You can ask. I might not answer. Do you think Lily would have wanted Marcus to leave Savannah? Do you think she would have wanted him to disappear from your family's life completely? Grace's eyes filled with tears for the second time since we'd started talking. That's the question that's haunted me for 10 years, Mrs. Stone. Because based on that voice message I played for you, based on everything I knew about my sister's character, I think Lily would have wanted Marcus to get help and heal and find a way to live a meaningful life. Even after what he did to her, especially after what he did to her, Lily believed in redemption. She believed that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves. She wouldn't have wanted Marcus to spend the rest of his life paralyzed by guilt and self-hatred. But she also wouldn't have wanted him to forget her or pretend the accident never happened. No, she wouldn't have wanted that either. And I think that's where Marcus struggled. How do you honor someone's memory while still moving forward with your own life? How do you carry the weight of responsibility without letting it destroy you? I thought about Marcus in our garden, the way he'd talk to the plants while he worked as if he were having conversations with someone I couldn't see. I thought about his insistence on donating to children's charities every year, contributions he'd never explained beyond saying they were important to him. I thought about the way he'd sometimes hold me extra tight after we'd watched a movie about death or loss, as if he were afraid I might disappear. I think he found a way to remember her while still building something beautiful, I said finally. I think so too. And I think that's what Lily would have wanted. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of us processing the conversation and what it meant for our understanding of Marcus's story. Finally, Grace spoke again. Mrs. Stone, Olive, I need to tell you something else. Something I've never told anyone, not even my parents. What is it? 6 months after Marcus left Savannah, I hired a private investigator to find him. This was unexpected. After everything Grace had shared about her family's anger and Marcus's exile, I couldn't imagine why she would have wanted to track him down. Why? Because I was carrying around so much anger and grief that it was poisoning my life. I couldn't move forward, couldn't heal, couldn't even think about my own future without being consumed by rage about what Marcus had done to Lily. And you thought finding him would help? I thought confronting him would help. I thought if I could look him in the eye and tell him exactly how much damage he'd caused, if I could make him face the full consequences of his actions, then maybe I could let go of some of the anger. Did you find him? The investigator tracked him to Denver, sent me photos of Marcus working construction, living in a small apartment, basically starting over from nothing. He looked older, thinner, like he'd aged years in the months since leaving Savannah. Grace pulled out her phone again, scrolling through old files until she found what she was looking for. I still have one of the photos. She showed me a picture of Marcus from 10 years ago, standing outside a construction site wearing a hard hat and safety vest. He was recognizable, but different from the man I'd married, his face drawn with an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. This was taken about 8 months after he left Savannah. The investigator said Marcus was working 12-hour days, living alone, didn't seem to have any social connections or relationships. He was basically just surviving. Did you go to Denver to confront him? I planned to. I bought a plane ticket, made arrangements to take time off work, rehearsed everything I wanted to say to him about Lily and justice, and the devastation he'd left behind. What stopped you? Grace stared at the photo for a long moment before answering. I was at the airport, literally sitting at the gate waiting to board, when I started thinking about what Lily would say if she knew what I was planning. And I realized that flying to Denver to ambush Marcus with my anger wasn't going to honor my sister's memory. It was just going to spread more pain and destruction. So you didn't go? I didn't go. Instead, I came home and started seeing a therapist to work through my grief in healthier ways. And over the next few years, I gradually stopped thinking about Marcus as the villain of Lily's story, and started thinking about him as another casualty of that terrible night. Another casualty? Someone whose life was also destroyed by what happened, just in a different way. Someone who was also struggling to figure out how to move forward after experiencing something traumatic and life-changing. The idea that Marcus had been a casualty rather than just a perpetrator was one I'd never considered. But looking at that photo of him alone and exhausted in Denver, I could see what Grace meant. Olive, I want you to know that when I learned Marcus had died, when Victoria told me he'd been married and living in Colorado, my first feeling wasn't satisfaction or justice. It was sadness. Because it meant that whatever healing and growth he'd managed to achieve, whatever peace he'd found with you, it had been cut short, just like Lily's future was cut short. Do you think he ever found peace with what happened? Based on what you've told me about your marriage, I think he found a way to live with purpose despite what happened. I think he learned to build something meaningful, instead of just surviving from day to day. Grace checked her watch and began gathering her things. I need to get home to my family. But Olive, before I go, I want to give you something. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. This was Lily's. She always carried it with her, said it reminded her to stay focused on what was really important. I unwrapped the package to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a stethoscope. It was a graduation gift from our parents, something to represent her dream of becoming a doctor. I've been carrying it around for 10 years, not sure what to do with it. Grace, I can't take this. It belongs to your family. It belongs with someone who understands what it means to love Marcus despite his flaws. Someone who can wear it as a reminder that good people sometimes make terrible mistakes, but that doesn't mean they can't also create something beautiful. I held the necklace carefully, understanding the weight of what Grace was entrusting to me. Why are you giving this to me? Because Lily believed in second chances. Because she would have wanted Marcus to find love and happiness, even after what happened. And because you represent proof that people can change and grow and become better versions of themselves. Grace stood up to leave, then paused and looked back at me. Olive, there's one more thing you should know. Something that might help you understand why Victoria and the rest of Marcus's family have been so resistant to accepting you as part of his story. What is it? Marcus wasn't supposed to be driving that night. The original plan was for Lily to drive herself home after the party. She had her own car, her own keys, her own way of getting safely home. Then why was she in Marcus's car? Because Marcus begged her to let him drive her home. Because he said he wanted to spend more time with her, wanted to continue their conversation somewhere private. Because he convinced her that riding with him would be romantic, a chance for them to work through their problems together. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just made bad decisions while driving drunk. He'd actively convinced Lily to get into his car instead of driving herself safely home. That's the detail that's hardest for his family to forgive. Grace continued. The fact that Lily would still be alive if Marcus had just let her drive herself home the way she'd originally planned. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? Because it's the most damning part of the story. It's the detail that makes Marcus look not just reckless, but manipulative. It's the thing that turns a tragic accident into something that feels more deliberate. Grace put her hand on my shoulder, her expression sympathetic. But it's also the detail that convinced me Marcus genuinely loved Lily, even if he loved her in unhealthy ways. He didn't convince her to ride with him because he wanted to hurt her. He convinced her because he was desperate to hold on to their relationship, desperate to find a way through their problems. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know. That's something you'll have to decide for yourself. With that, Grace Chen walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with a silver necklace and a more complete understanding of the tragedy that had shaped my husband's life. I sat there for another hour, turning the pendant over in my hands and trying to process everything I'd learned. Marcus had been controlling and possessive with Lily in ways that had contributed to her death. But he'd also spent 10 years learning to love differently, learning to support rather than limit the people he cared about. He'd carried the weight of his mistakes, without letting them destroy his capacity for growth and connection. The man I'd married had been both the boy who'd killed Lily Chen and the man who'd encouraged my dreams. He'd been someone capable of terrible judgment and beautiful transformation. He'd been human in all the complicated, contradictory ways that human beings actually are. As I walked back to my motel through Savannah's historic streets, I realized that my journey to understand Marcus's past had ended up being a journey to understand something more fundamental about love and forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. I'd come to Georgia thinking I needed to defend my husband's memory against his family's anger. Instead, I'd learned that the truth was more complex than anyone's version of events could capture. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out how to get home to Colorado and what to do with this new understanding of the man I'd lost. But tonight, I would wear Lily Chen's necklace and think about second chances and the strange ways that love persists, even in the aftermath of tragedy. I woke up Sunday morning with Lily's necklace still clutched in my palm, the small stethoscope pendant having left an impression on my skin from gripping it so tightly through the night. Outside my motel window, Savannah was coming alive with church bells and the distant sound of gospel music drifting from nearby congregations. The contrast between the city's spiritual awakening and my own emotional turmoil felt profound. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother in Wyoming, 2 from my friend Sarah back in Boulder, and a voicemail from our landlord asking when I'd be returning to deal with Marcus's belongings. The real world was calling me back, demanding practical decisions about insurance policies and lease agreements and all the mundane details that follow death. But I wasn't ready to leave Georgia yet. There was still one conversation I needed to have. I dressed carefully in the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral, fastened Lily's necklace around my neck, and took a taxi to the Whitmore family estate. Dr. Richardson had mentioned it during our cemetery conversation, describing it as a historic mansion in the Garden District where Marcus had grown up. If I was going to confront Victoria one final time, it seemed appropriate to do it on her home territory. The Whitmore estate was everything I'd expected from old Savannah money. A 3-story antebellum mansion surrounded by ancient oaks and carefully manicured gardens, the kind of place that had probably been in the family for generations. As I stood at the wrought iron gates, I could see why Marcus might have felt suffocated here, why he might have needed to escape to the wide-open spaces of Colorado to breathe freely. I pressed the intercom button, not entirely sure what I would say if Victoria answered. Yes? The voice was crisp, professional, probably a housekeeper. My name is Olive Stone. I'd like to speak with Victoria Whitmore if she's available. There was a long pause, followed by the sound of conversation in the background that I couldn't quite make out. Please wait, the voice said finally. 5 minutes later, Victoria herself walked down the circular driveway toward the gate. She was dressed casually in jeans and a white blouse, looking younger and more approachable than she had during our previous encounters. But her expression was guarded, and she stopped several feet away from the gate without opening it. Mrs. Stone, I wasn't expecting to see you again. I need to talk to you about what I learned yesterday. About Marcus and Lily and what really happened that night. Victoria's jaw tightened. I assume you spoke with Grace Chen. She told me things that changed my understanding of the situation, things I think you need to hear. Such as? I pulled Lily's necklace from beneath my dress, holding the pendant where Victoria could see it clearly. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment her composed facade cracked entirely. Where did you get that? Grace gave it to me, along with a recording of Lily talking about Marcus just days before she died, along with the truth about why Marcus convinced her to ride with him that night, instead of driving herself home. Victoria's face had gone pale. She looked at the necklace for several long moments before reaching for the gate's electronic lock. You'd better come inside. The interior of the Whitmore mansion was as impressive as its exterior, all polished hardwood floors and crystal chandeliers and oil paintings that probably dated back centuries. Victoria led me through a formal living room into a smaller, more comfortable sitting area that looked out over the gardens. Would you like coffee? Tea? Coffee would be nice. She disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen, leaving me alone to study the family photographs that covered every available surface. There were pictures of Marcus at various ages, from a gap-toothed boy on a bicycle to a serious teenager in a graduation cap and gown. In all of them, he looked well cared for but somehow isolated, as if he were performing happiness rather than feeling it. One photograph in particular caught my attention. It showed Marcus and a girl who had to be Lily at what looked like a school dance. They were both dressed formally, but while Lily was laughing genuinely at something off camera, Marcus was staring at her with an intensity that seemed almost possessive. Even in that frozen moment, I could see the dynamic Grace had described, the way Marcus seemed to need Lily more than she needed him. Victoria returned with a silver coffee service that probably cost more than my car, setting it on the antique table between us with practiced grace. "You saw the photograph of Marcus and Lily. Is that from their senior prom?" "Junior prom, actually. 2 years before the accident." Victoria poured coffee for both of us, her hands steady, despite the emotion I could see in her eyes. They were already talking about marriage then, making plans for their future together. Marcus was intense about their relationship. Grace said he was controlling. Marcus was terrified of abandonment. After our father died, he became convinced that everyone he loved would eventually leave him. With Lily, that fear manifested as possessiveness that grew stronger as graduation approached. Victoria sat down across from me, cradling her coffee cup as if seeking warmth from it. "Mrs. Stone, Olive, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you as if you were somehow responsible for Marcus's decision to leave Savannah, as if your very existence was proof that he'd abandoned his family for something better. And now? Now I'm beginning to understand that you might have been the person who finally taught Marcus how to love without fear." The admission seemed to cost her something, and I could see her struggling with emotions she'd probably been suppressing for years. "Victoria, why didn't anyone tell me about Marcus trying to contact the Chen family before he left? Why didn't anyone mention that he'd actually attempted to take responsibility?" "Because acknowledging that Marcus tried to make amends would have meant admitting that our family's anger might have been part of what drove him away. It was easier to maintain the narrative that he was simply a coward who ran from his problems. But you knew better." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where Marcus had presumably played as a child. "I knew that. Marcus wrote letters to the Chen family that were never sent. I knew that he stopped eating and sleeping and basically fell apart after Lily died. I knew that he was consumed by guilt and self-hatred in ways that scared everyone who loved him." "Then why were you so angry about him leaving?" "Because I was 26 years old and dealing with my own grief about losing the brother I'd grown up with. Because I couldn't understand how Marcus could start over somewhere else while the rest of us were left to live every day in a town that reminded us of what he'd done." Victoria set down her coffee and looked directly at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But mostly because I was terrified that if Marcus could disappear so completely, if he could become someone else in Colorado and never look back, then maybe the brother I'd loved and protected my whole life had never really existed at all." The vulnerability in her admission was startling. I'd been thinking about Victoria as Marcus's disapproving sister, someone who'd written him off as a disappointment. I hadn't considered that his departure might have felt like abandonment to the family members who'd loved him before the accident. "Victoria, did Marcus ever try to contact you after he left? Any of you?" Number, and that silence was almost worse than not knowing where he was. At least if he'd called or written, we'd have known he was alive and okay. The complete silence made it feel like he'd chosen to erase us from his life entirely. Maybe he thought staying away was kinder. Maybe he thought contact would just cause more pain. Maybe. Or maybe he was so ashamed of what he'd done that he couldn't bear to face anyone who'd known him before. We sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, both of us processing the complexity of a situation that had no clear villains or heroes, just people trying to navigate impossible grief in imperfect ways. "Olive, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Did Marcus ever talk about having children? About building a family in Colorado?" The question caught me off guard. Marcus and I had discussed children abstractly, the way married couples do when they're not quite ready but assume it will happen eventually. We talked about it sometimes. Why? Because Lily was pregnant when she died. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Grace hadn't mentioned this, nor had Dr. Richardson or anyone else who'd told me about the accident. Pregnant? 6 weeks along. She probably didn't even know yet herself, but the autopsy revealed it. Marcus and Lily were going to have a baby. I felt the room spinning around me, the full magnitude of that night's tragedy suddenly expanding beyond what I'd thought possible to comprehend. Not only had Marcus caused Lily's death, he'd also been responsible for ending a pregnancy that might have developed into their child. Did Marcus know? We never told him. The pregnancy wasn't far enough along for Lily to have shown any symptoms. and with everything else that happened, we decided it would only add to his guilt and grief. But you're telling me now. Why? Victoria leaned forward, her expression intense. Because I want you to understand the complete weight of what Marcus was carrying when he left Savannah. I want you to know that his decision to disappear wasn't just about avoiding consequences or running from responsibility. It was about living with the knowledge that he'd destroyed not just one life, but potentially two. And you think that changes something? I think it explains why Marcus might have felt like he couldn't stay in Savannah, even if he'd wanted to. I think it explains why he might have needed to become someone entirely different in order to survive psychologically. The information was overwhelming, adding another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. But it also helped me understand something about the Marcus I'd married, something about his fierce protectiveness when it came to my dreams and ambitions. Victoria, I need to tell you something that Grace shared with me yesterday. I told her about the voice recording, about Lily's plans to help Marcus get therapy for his abandonment fears, about her hope that they could find a way to pursue their individual dreams while building a life together. Lily was trying to save him, I concluded. She was working toward a solution that might have prevented the whole tragedy. Victoria listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face as I described her brother's final conversation with the girl he'd loved. She sounds exactly like the Lily I remember, Victoria said when I finished. Generous and wise and determined to believe the best about people, even when they didn't deserve it. Do you think Marcus deserved it? Her faith in him, her willingness to work through their problems? I think Marcus was a 18-year-old boy who was drowning in grief and fear and didn't have the emotional tools to handle either one in healthy ways. I think Lily's faith in him was probably the most precious thing in his life, and losing it along with losing her must have felt unbearable. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens with an expression of profound sadness. Olive, there's something else I need to tell you, something I should have said when you first arrived in Savannah. What is it? Marcus did try to contact us, once. About 5 years ago, he sent a letter to this house. My heart jumped. What did it say? He said he was living in Colorado and working in construction. He said he'd gotten married to someone who made him want to be a better person. He said he thought about Lily and our family every day, and that he hoped we'd found some measure of peace. Why didn't you respond? Because I was still too angry. Because reading about his new life felt like salt in wounds that hadn't healed. Because I couldn't bear the idea that he'd moved on while we were still stuck in the aftermath of that terrible night. Victoria turned back to face me, her expression filled with regret. But he also said something else in that letter, something I've been thinking about ever since you arrived in Savannah. What? He said that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped his family in Colorado would know that his years here had been filled with love and purpose. He said he'd tried to build a life that would honor the memory of everyone he'd lost. The words took my breath away. Marcus had been thinking about his death, preparing for the possibility that I might someday need to understand his past. He knew I might come here someday. I think he hoped you would. I think he wanted his two families to meet each other, even if he couldn't figure out how to make that happen while he was alive. Victoria returned to her chair, reaching into a side table drawer and pulling out an envelope that looked worn from handling. This is the letter Marcus sent 5 years ago. I've read it probably 100 times, trying to decide whether I should respond, whether I should try to rebuild some kind of relationship with him. She handed me the envelope, and I recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. My name was written on the back in pencil, as if he'd wanted to make sure I would eventually see this. He wrote my name on it. He wanted you to read it if something ever happened to him. He wanted you to know that leaving Savannah didn't mean he'd forgotten his past, or stopped caring about the people he'd hurt. I opened the letter carefully, my hands shaking as I unfolded pages covered in Marcus's familiar script. Victoria, he'd written, I know this letter will probably surprise you, and I understand if you decide not to respond. I've thought about writing to you and the rest of our family countless times over the past 5 years, but I could never find the right words to bridge the gap between who I was in Savannah and who I've become in Colorado. I want you to know that I'm okay, not happy in any simple way, because I don't think I'll ever stop feeling the weight of what happened to Lily. But I've found a kind of peace here, a way to live with purpose despite the terrible mistakes I made as a teenager. I'm married now to a woman named Olive, who sees goodness in me that I'm still learning to see in myself. She's an artist, brilliant and talented and brave in ways that remind me of Lily sometimes. She doesn't know about my past yet, about the accident, or about why I left Georgia. I've been afraid to tell her because I don't want her to look at me the way people in Savannah learned to look at me after Lily died. But I think about telling her the truth more and more often, because the love she's shown me feels strong enough to survive even the worst parts of my history. She's taught me that it's possible to support someone's dreams instead of feeling threatened by them. She's taught me that love doesn't have to be possessive or controlling to be real. I know that doesn't undo the damage I caused, and I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or absolution. I'm writing because I want you to know that Lily's death wasn't meaningless. It taught me how to love better, how to be the kind of partner who encourages growth instead of limiting it. It taught me that running away from consequences isn't the same thing as running towards something better. If you're reading this letter, Victoria, it probably means something has happened to me and Olive is trying to understand who I really was. If she comes to Savannah looking for answers, please be kind to her. Please help her understand that the Marcus Stone she married was built on the foundation of lessons I learned from losing Lily Chen. Please help her see that even though I made terrible choices as a boy, I spent every day afterward trying to become someone worthy of the love I'd been given. I miss our family. I miss Sunday dinners and holidays and the feeling of belonging somewhere. But I also know that I needed to leave Savannah to become the person I was meant to be. I needed to learn how to live with my mistakes without being defined entirely by them. I hope you can forgive me someday, not for Lily's death, because I know that's unforgivable, but for disappearing when you needed your brother most. I hope you understand that staying would have destroyed me completely, and that wouldn't have honored Lily's memory or helped anyone heal. Give my love to grandmother and to Thomas and to anyone else who remembers the good parts of who I used to be. With hope for understanding, Marcus, I finished reading with tears streaming down my face, finally understanding the impossible position Marcus had been in when he left Savannah. He'd known that staying would hurt his family, but he'd also known that leaving would hurt them in different ways. He'd chosen the path that allowed him to survive and grow, even though it meant accepting the pain of permanent separation from everyone who'd known him before. Victoria, I said when I could speak again, why didn't you ever respond to this letter? Because I was a coward, she replied simply. Because acknowledging that Marcus had found happiness in Colorado would have meant letting go of the anger that had sustained me for years. Because admitting that he'd learned to love better would have meant accepting that maybe his leaving had served a purpose. And now? Victoria stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a photo album that looked well worn from frequent viewing. Now I think I understand what Lily would have wanted for Marcus. And I think I understand what Marcus would have wanted for the woman he married. She opened the album to a page near the back, revealing photographs I'd never seen before. Marcus as a young boy building sandcastles on a beach. Marcus as a teenager working in the garden behind the house. Marcus laughing with Victoria at some family celebration, both of them looking genuinely happy. These are the memories I should have shared with you when you first arrived in Savannah, Victoria said. These are the parts of Marcus's story that explain why Lily fell in love with him, why our family mourned him when he left, why his capacity for growth and change shouldn't have surprised anyone who really knew him. Why are you showing me this now? Because you came 2,000 miles to say goodbye to your husband, and instead of helping you honor his memory, we made you fight for the right to grieve. Because Marcus's story doesn't belong only to Savannah, and his family doesn't consist only of the people who knew him before he learned to love without fear. Victoria closed the photo album and handed it to me. This is yours now. Marcus would have wanted you to see these pictures, to understand the boy he was before he became the man you married. I can't take your family photos. You're not taking them. You're inheriting them. As Marcus's wife, as the person who knew him best during the final years of his life. You have a right to these memories. The generosity of the gesture was overwhelming, but it also felt like a final acknowledgement of something I'd been fighting for since arriving in Georgia. Recognition that I had been Marcus's family too. That our marriage had been real and meaningful despite its relatively short duration. Victoria, there's something I need to ask you, something I need to understand before I leave Savannah. What is it? Do you think Marcus was happy? In Colorado, with me? During the years we had together? Victoria smiled for the first time since I'd met her, expression that transformed her entire face and made her look remarkably like the Marcus I remembered. Olive, I think Marcus found something in Colorado that he'd been searching for his entire life. I think he found a way to love and be loved that didn't require him to diminish anyone else's dreams or potential. How can you be sure? Because the Marcus I knew before the accident was consumed by fear of abandonment. He clung to people and relationships in ways that were suffocating and ultimately destructive. But the Marcus who wrote that letter 5 years ago, the Marcus who encouraged your art and supported your ambitions, that was someone who'd learned to love with open hands. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And because Grace Chen called me this morning to tell me about your conversation yesterday. She said you were wearing Lily's necklace like it belonged to you, like you understood the weight of what it represented. She said she could see why Marcus had fallen in love with you. The revelation that Grace had called Victoria surprised me, but it also felt like another piece of healing in a story that had been defined by broken communication for too long. What else did Grace say? She said that meeting you had helped her understand that Marcus's leaving Savannah might have been the most loving thing he could have done for everyone involved. She said that the man you described, the man who'd learned to encourage rather than control, was probably closer to who Lily had hoped Marcus could become than anyone who'd stayed in Savannah ever would have been. And you agree with that? I think Marcus spent 10 years learning how to honor Lily's memory by becoming the kind of partner she'd always believed he could be. I think his marriage to you was proof that people can change and grow and become better versions of themselves, even after making terrible mistakes. Victoria walked to her purse and pulled out a checkbook, writing quickly before tearing off a check and handing it to me. This is for your travel expenses and whatever you need to get home to Colorado safely. I looked at the check and saw that she'd written it for $5,000, far more than I'd spent on the trip to Georgia. Victoria, I can't accept this. Yes, you can. It's Marcus's inheritance from our father's estate, money that should have been his if he'd stayed in Savannah. Consider it his final gift to the woman he loved. But this belongs to your family. You are our family. Marcus made you our family when he married you, and we should have recognized that from the beginning. The acknowledgement was everything I'd been hoping for since arriving in Savannah, but receiving it felt bittersweet. I'd won the recognition I'd fought for, but at the cost of learning that the man I'd married had been carrying secrets and guilt that I'd never fully understood. Victoria, if Marcus had lived longer, do you think he ever would have told me the truth about Lily and the accident? I think he was building toward it. I think he was trying to figure out how to share that part of his history without destroying the life you'd built together. And you think our marriage could have survived that revelation? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the careful attention of someone making an important assessment. I think your marriage was strong enough to survive anything, because it was built on Marcus's determination to love you better than he'd ever loved anyone before. I think the truth about his past would have been painful for both of you, but it wouldn't have changed the fundamental fact that he'd learned to be the kind of husband Lily always believed he could become. Even knowing that he'd been responsible for someone's death? Even knowing that he'd spent every day since then trying to build a life that honored rather than repeated his mistakes. Victoria stood up, smoothing her jeans and extending her hand to me in a gesture that felt like both goodbye and welcome. Olive, I want you to know that you'll always have family in Savannah. If you ever want to visit, if you ever want to know more about Marcus's childhood, or the good memories we have of him, you'll be welcome here. Thank you. That means more than I can express. And I want you to know that we'll be visiting Marcus's grave regularly, making sure it's cared for and remembered. But if you ever want to move him to Colorado, if you ever want to bring him home to the place where he was happiest, we won't stand in your way. The offer was unexpected and generous. Acknowledging that Marcus's final resting place should perhaps be determined by where he'd chosen to build his adult life, rather than where he'd been born. I'll think about that. Right now, I just need to process everything I've learned. Of course. But Olive, before you leave, I want to give you one more thing. Victoria disappeared into another room, returning with a small wooden box that looked like it had been crafted by hand. Marcus made this in high school shop class. It was supposed to be a jewelry box for Lily, but he never got the chance to give it to her. I've been keeping it all these years, not sure what to do with it. I opened the box carefully, revealing purple velvet lining and a small brass nameplate that read, "For L, with all my love, M." Victoria, this should stay with your family. No, it should go with someone who understands what it represents. Someone who knows that Marcus spent his whole life learning how to love completely, without needing to possess completely. I closed the box and held it carefully, understanding that I was being entrusted with something precious and irreplaceable. I'll take good care of it. I know you will. We walked to the front door together, both of us seeming reluctant to end a conversation that had been years in the making. As Victoria opened the door, she turned to me one final time. Olive, I have one last question for you. What is it? Are you glad you came to Savannah? Are you glad you learned the truth about Marcus's past, even though it was painful? I thought about everything I'd discovered over the past few days. The tragedy of Lily's death, the complexity of Marcus's guilt, the years of anger and misunderstanding that had separated him from his family. I thought about the weight of secrets and the price of transformation. I'm glad I came, I said finally. Because now I understand that the Marcus I married wasn't hiding from his past, he was building on it. He wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was becoming who he'd always had the potential to be. And that's enough? Knowing that your marriage was real, even if it was built on a foundation you didn't fully understand? That's everything. That's all I needed to know. Victoria hugged me then, a gesture that felt like forgiveness and acceptance and the beginning of something new. Have a safe trip home, Olive. And remember, you'll always have family in Georgia. The taxi ride back to my motel gave me time to process the morning's revelations and plan my journey home. I'd arrived in Savannah angry and desperate, fighting for recognition and answers that seemed impossible to obtain. I was leaving with more knowledge than I'd expected, and a sense of peace I hadn't dared hope for. That evening, I called my parents in Wyoming to let them know I'd be home soon. "How are you holding up, honey?" my mother asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm okay, Mom. Better than okay, actually. I learned things about Marcus that were hard to hear, but they helped me understand him in ways I never had before. Are you ready to come home and start figuring out what comes next?" I looked around my dingy motel room, thinking about the converted barn in Colorado that would feel empty without Marcus's presence. Thinking about the paintings I'd need to finish and the life I'd need to rebuild, and the strange gift of understanding I'd been given by his family and friends. I'm ready. I'll be home in a few days. We love you, Olive. We're proud of how strong you've been through all of this. I love you too. After hanging up, I packed my few belongings and prepared for the journey back to Colorado. I'd hitchhiked to Georgia in desperation, but Victoria's check would allow me to fly home with dignity. More importantly, I'd be returning with Marcus's photo albums, Lily's necklace, and the wooden jewelry box he'd crafted as a teenager. I'd be bringing home pieces of his history that would help me remember him completely. 3 days later, I stood in our barn in Colorado, surrounded by Marcus's work boots and coffee mugs and all the ordinary objects that make up a shared life. But now they felt different, weighted with new meaning and understanding. The man who'd worn those boots had been carrying guilt and grief and hard-won wisdom. The man who'd used that coffee mug had been someone who'd learned to love without fear, because he'd experienced the devastating consequences of loving with fear. I hung Lily's necklace in the bedroom we'd shared, not as a shrine to Marcus's past, but as a reminder of the person who'd helped shape him into the man I'd married. I placed his childhood photos on the mantel next to pictures from our wedding, creating a visual timeline that connected the boy he'd been to the man he'd become. The wooden jewelry box I kept on my dresser, filling it with the engagement ring and wedding band that had symbolized our life together. Marcus had never been able to give that box to Lily, but in a strange way, it had found its intended purpose. It was holding tokens of love that had grown from the foundation of lessons learned and mistakes mourned. 6 months later, I received a package from Savannah with no return address. Inside was a small watercolor painting that took my breath away. It showed the view from Marcus's childhood bedroom window, the gardens and oak trees of the Whitmore estate rendered in soft, careful brushstrokes. At the bottom, in familiar handwriting, was a note from Victoria. Olive, it read, "I found this among Marcus's things from high school. He painted it during the summer, before his senior year, before everything changed. I thought you might like to see the world through his eyes before he learned to carry so much weight. He was always an artist, just like you. Love, Victoria." I hung the painting in my studio, next to the canvases I'd been working on since returning from Georgia. Marcus's adolescent artwork reminded me that creativity and beauty could emerge from any circumstances, that the impulse to make something meaningful was stronger than guilt or grief or the weight of terrible mistakes. A year after Marcus's death, I held my first gallery showing. The paintings I'd created during the months following my trip to Savannah were different from my earlier work, deeper and more complex, informed by everything I'd learned about love and loss and the possibility of redemption. The centerpiece was a large canvas I'd titled Second Chances, showing a garden where new flowers grew among the ruins of something old and broken. Grace Chen attended the opening, flying from Georgia to Colorado to see the work that had emerged from our difficult conversations. We stood together in front of the painting, both of us understanding that art could transform even the most painful experiences into something beautiful and meaningful. "Lily would have loved this," Grace said quietly. "She always believed that everything could be made into something better if you approached it with enough creativity and hope." I think Marcus believed that too, eventually. I think that's what he was trying to do with his life after leaving Savannah. Creating something beautiful from something broken? Creating something beautiful because of something broken. Using the pain as raw material instead of trying to escape from it. 3 years after Marcus's death, Victoria called to tell me that Lily's parents had finally agreed to meet with her and Grace. The conversation had been difficult but healing, opening the possibility for new understanding and connection between the families whose lives had been intertwined by tragedy. "They asked about you," Victoria said. "About Marcus's wife and the life he'd built in Colorado. I told them about your paintings and how much Marcus had supported your dreams. I told them he'd learned to love the way Lily always hoped he could." "How did they respond?" Mrs. Chen cried. She said it gave her comfort to know that something positive had emerged from that terrible night, that Marcus had found a way to honor Lily's memory by becoming a better person. "And Mr. Chen?" "He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he wished he'd been strong enough to respond to Marcus's attempts at apology before it was too late. He said he regretted that anger had kept him from seeing that Marcus was just a boy who'd made a devastating mistake. 5 years after Marcus's death, I remarried. The new relationship was different from what I'd had with Marcus, built on full disclosure and complete honesty about both our pasts. I told my new husband about Marcus and Lily and the complicated legacy of love and loss that had shaped me. He listened without judgment, understanding that the capacity for deep love often comes from having experienced deep loss. The night before my second wedding, I sat in the garden Marcus and I had planted together, wearing Lily's necklace and thinking about the strange ways that love persists across time and tragedy. The roses he'd helped me plant were blooming again, proof that beautiful things could grow from careful tending, even after the gardener was gone. I thought about Marcus working in that same garden, his hands gentle with seedlings as he'd encouraged my dreams. I thought about Lily Chen planning a future that would honor both love and ambition. I thought about second chances, and the possibility of building something meaningful from the fragments of broken dreams. The wooden jewelry box sat on my dresser, now holding new rings that symbolized new promises. But it also held Marcus's wedding band, a reminder that love doesn't end with death, it transforms into something else. Something that can inform new relationships without overshadowing them, something that can teach without demanding, something that can honor the past while embracing the future. 10 years after Marcus's death, I returned to Savannah for the dedication of a scholarship fund in Lily Chen's memory. The scholarship would support young women pursuing medical degrees, ensuring that Lily's dream of healing others would continue through new generations of doctors. Victoria and Grace had worked together to establish the fund, using money from Marcus's estate and donations from the Savannah community. At the dedication ceremony, they announced that the scholarship's first recipient would be someone who embodied Lily's spirit of combining academic excellence with compassion for others. This scholarship represents the belief that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story, Grace said in her speech. It represents the possibility that even our deepest losses can be transformed into gifts for the future. After the ceremony, I visited Marcus's grave for the first time since his funeral. The headstone Victoria had chosen was simple but beautiful, engraved with his name and dates and the words, "Beloved husband, son, and brother. He learned to love well." Below that, in smaller script, was a line I recognized from one of Lily's favorite poems. "What we plant in the soil of contemplation, we shall reap in the harvest of action." I placed fresh flowers on both Marcus's grave and Lily's, understanding finally that their stories were interconnected in ways that transcended guilt and forgiveness. They had both been young people trying to navigate the complexities of love and ambition. One had died before learning how to balance those competing demands. The other had spent his remaining years practicing that balance every day. Standing in that Georgia cemetery surrounded by Spanish moss and ancient stones, I felt a sense of completion that had taken a decade to achieve. I'd hitchhiked across the country to attend my husband's funeral and had been initially banned from entering. But in fighting for my right to grieve, I'd uncovered a story more complex and ultimately more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. Marcus had been flawed and human, and capable of both terrible mistakes and profound growth. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of lessons learned from tragedy, but that didn't make it less real or meaningful. If anything, it made it more precious. Proof that people could change, and love could evolve, and second chances were always possible for those brave enough to seek them. As I prepared to leave Savannah for what I knew would be the final time, I understood that my journey had come full circle. I'd arrived as a stranger fighting for recognition, and I was leaving as someone who finally understood the full scope of love's capacity for transformation. Marcus's story didn't end with his death. It continued through the lives he'd touched, the lessons he'd learned, and the love he'd given and received. Sometimes the most powerful endings aren't about closure, but about understanding that some stories are too big for any single ending to contain. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.